In this analysis, we're going to see a massive, frankly fascinating geopolitical shift unfolding right next door. We're zeroing in on Nepal's new government under Prime Minister Balen Shah and this incredibly complex diplomatic tightrope they're walking right now. With shifting alliances, an intense tug-of-war between global superpowers, and very real economic friction happening down at the border level, it's basically a high-stakes geopolitical chessboard. So let's map it out. Okay, let's dive into this roadmap. We're going to start by looking at the traditional historical ties, then move right into Nepal's brand new equal distance policy. From there, we'll see the macro geopolitics trickling down into cross-border trade frictions, zoom out to the US-China tug-of-war, and wrap up with India's current wait-and-watch strategy. So, starting right at the foundation, Section 1, the traditional border bond. To truly grasp the friction happening today, we absolutely have to understand the baseline. Historically, the India-Nepal relationship is described by this traditional term from our source material, the Roti-Beti relationship. This isn't just your standard political alliance. We're talking about a deeply ingrained cultural and familial bond. It's an open border. Families intermarry, people cross freely for work and trade every single day. And the two nations basically share an inseparable past and future. It's always been viewed as a special, highly privileged relationship. Now, terminology here is absolutely crucial for understanding the dynamic. If you read Western media, you're almost always going to see India described as a big brother to Nepal, and that carries a pretty negative, controlling connotation, right? But the source points out that India's self-perception is actually quite different. It views itself in a traditional paternal role as an elder brother. In that context, an elder brother provides care, guidance, and affection, while maybe occasionally correcting the younger brother. Understanding this psychological baseline is essential as we look at Nepal's recent pushback. And that pushback leads us straight to Section 2, Nepal's equal distance policy. Now, what's really interesting about this shift is how dramatically the diplomatic protocols have changed under Prime Minister Balen Shah. Traditionally, recognizing that special relationship we just talked about, a newly elected Nepali prime minister would basically always meet with Indian diplomats first. But look at this new approach. Immediately upon taking office, PM Balen Shah held a joint meeting with 17 ambassadors simultaneously. He brought in representatives from the US, China, India, and even Pakistan, all into the exact same room at the exact same time. It was a very clear, highly calculated signal that the traditional hierarchy is being dismantled. Which brings us to the core doctrine of the new administration. They are actively implementing a policy of equal distance and equal proximity. Their manifesto champions what they call Nepal First pragmatism. Basically, they intend to leverage the massive economic rise of both India and China for Nepal's own development. By treating India, China, and the US as complete 100% diplomatic equals, Nepal is aggressively asserting its sovereignty and trying to maximize global investments. And this analogy perfectly illustrates the geopolitical rebrand Nepal is going for. For decades, both India and China have viewed Nepal primarily as a buffer state, a strategic cushion nestled up in the Himalayas, keeping the two giant Asian powers apart. But Nepal's new government is softly but firmly rejecting that label. They are officially declaring themselves a bridge state. They don't want to be a cushion anymore. They want to be the vital link connecting these powers, and of course, benefiting economically from both sides in the process. But as we know, grand, high-level geopolitical shifts always cause friction on the ground. Let's look at Section 3, cross-border trade frictions. This tiny number, literally just 100 Indian rupees, is causing a massive headache right now. Historically, customs rules on the border were super loose because of that traditional Roti-Beti relationship. But recently, Nepal has begun strictly enforcing customs duties ranging anywhere from 5% to a staggering 80% on goods brought in from India that exceed just 100 rupees. Now, this sudden enforcement is meant to boost Nepal's local production, but on the ground, it has completely paralyzed traditional Indian border markets like Jogbani and Banbasa, and it's making local prices inside Nepal spike. Well, in geopolitics, every action has a reaction. India has responded with its own strict adherence to the rules, which the source calls reciprocal measures. For instance, citing the need to curb bulk smuggling, fuel pumps on the Bihar border in places like Araria and Kishanganj have severely restricted fuel for Nepali vehicles. They're capping it at just 50 to 100 rupees. And since Nepal relies heavily on Indian fuel, that hits incredibly hard. Plus, India has suddenly implemented strict laboratory testing for all Nepali tea exports. Let's move along and see how this builds, because this tea issue is a textbook example of India quietly flexing its muscles. Nepal exports around 10,000 tons of tea annually, mostly right into India. Previously, it crossed the border with barely a second glance. Now, T-board officials pull random 500-gram samples, dispatch them to a lab within 24 hours, and then hold the entire shipment for a mandatory 14-day period just to check if it's fit for human consumption. Now, India is perfectly within its rates here. These are standard import rules, but applying them this rigidly is a very targeted reminder to Nepal of their immense mutual dependency. So, why is Nepal risking these vital trade ties? That brings us to Section 4, the U.S.-China tug-of-war. While those border tensions are simmering, Washington and Beijing are practically rushing into Kathmandu. Just listen to this quote from U.S. Assistant Secretary Paul Samir Kapoor during a recent visit. "We will not like the dominance of China or any other country in Nepal." According to our source's interpretation, the phrase any other country is a thinly veiled reference to India. The U.S. is making it abundantly clear that they see Nepal as an absolutely crucial battleground for influence in South Asia. And this brilliantly illustrates the incredibly difficult trap Nepal has essentially walked into. The United States is offering great things: foreign direct investment, trade, military ties, but they demand adherence to their digital rules, and they want to bring in Starlink. China, on the flip side, is offering massive Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure, but they're absolute red lines, blocking Starlink completely and demanding Nepal never officially recognize Tibetan refugees. Nepal wants the investments from both, but appeasing one superpower inherently violates the non-negotiable red lines of the other. It's a massive bind. So, as the US and China are scrambling for influence, where exactly is New Delhi in all this? Let's get into Section 5, India's wait-and-watch strategy. The source analysis points out that India doesn't actually need to panic, mainly because it holds a very big stick when it comes to leverage. Think about it. India controls the vital flow of remittances back to Nepal. It's the primary supplier of fuel and energy. And practically speaking, Nepal's 1,400-kilometer Himalayan border with China is incredibly rugged and just currently unviable for massive trade. That leaves Nepal entirely dependent on Indian transit routes. Add in those deep cultural and religious ties, like the shared reverence for Lumbini, and you can see why India is choosing soft tones and patience over a shouting match. You can actually see this measured restraint perfectly when you look at the diplomatic timeline. Between 2014 and 2022, Prime Minister Modi visited Nepal 5 times, actively prioritizing his neighborhood first policy. But contrast that with right now, while the US and China rushed delegations in during the very first month of PM Balen Shah's new government, India completely held back. Instead, India's Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri patiently waited for a formal invitation, eventually scheduling his first bilateral visit for mid-May. India's basically giving Nepal the space to play its cards, waiting to see if they realize the practical limits of US and Chinese promises. But India definitely isn't closing the door. The core message New Delhi is projecting here is that it's ready and willing to offer massive, concrete deliverables in energy, infrastructure, and trade connectivity. But, and this is a big but, that's provided Nepal reciprocates and acknowledges the basic ground realities of their unique geographic proximity. India is perfectly willing to look beyond these petty border disputes and grant big concessions for shared prosperity, but it requires a return to the mutual respect of that historic Roti-Beti baseline we discussed at the very beginning. Which leaves us with this final, genuinely fascinating question to ponder. As Nepal attempts to cast off its buffer state label and bridge the gap between global superpowers, will playing this modern great game actually successfully elevate its economic status? Or will the immense pressure of balancing the US, China, and India end up fracturing the traditional bonds that have held South Asia together for centuries? It is a serious high-stakes gamble, and the entire region is watching closely to see what happens next. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep exploring, and I'll catch you on the next one.